Well, it's green, so that usually means we're go. All right. So chapter 7, we have already discussed Paul's position regarding the Jews dying to sin based on perpetual grace, which was a misapplied and understood concept from the Jew at the conclusion of Romans 5 into 6. Paul deals with that false idea that they could receive perpetual grace by continuing to sin. God forbid. How can we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? Then he addresses the next question kind of subsequently. How and when did we die to sin? Well, you died to sin when you were baptized into Jesus Christ. You died with him, you were buried with him, and you rose with him to walk in newness of life. And then from there, Paul continues the thought and continues this idea of being dead to sin. He kind of he lists that out in more detail. So as we go into chapter 7, let me move my here. So what did that mean? What did that mean for the Jew then? All right, what really ultimately is the conclusion? Well, because you died to sin and you now have the grace of Christ, that means that you have been released from the law. You've been released from the law. Section verses 1 through 6, and I don't do a great job when I'm teaching. I'm rolling. I don't do a great job of announcing the sections and the verses, but I have them there in your notes, so you have them. But the first section is verses 1 through 6. Dead to the law, alive to God. Dead to the law, alive to God. All right, let's jump in. Verse 1. Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over the man as long as he liveth. So Paul is still addressing the rhetorical question posed in chapter 6, verse 15. If we go back there, what then? Shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? God forbid. Again, that question would be perpetual grace. Do you, because you have died to sin through the grace of Christ, does that mean now that you are under no law? All right, and of course that's not true. You're under law regardless. I mean, the fact that God exists mean that you're under law. Right? You can't. You're under men's law, Romans 13. You're under a moral law, Romans chapter 2. Which is Romans 1, by the way, which is how the Gentiles of antiquity would be judged. There is a moral law that exists. Thou shalt not kill didn't become a sin just at the Ten Commandments. Right? Cain killed Abel. He was held accountable for that, right? So murdering has always been wrong, even before the law of Moses came into existence. So law has always existed. We see that as far back as Genesis 2, 16 and 17. God said, you can eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you cannot eat of it, or you shall not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. So law is, we're always under law. The question for the Jew is, or the Jew might have is, all right, so Paul, if what you say is correct and we are saved by the grace of Jesus Christ and we're dead to sin, that means there's no law, right? Because where there is no law, there's no sin. Paul, you said that in chapter 5, verse 13, right? Where there is no law, there is no sin. And so Paul is still addressing that rhetorical question. So though his specific audience is Jewish at this point to whom he's writing, the Jewish Christian, this position is applicable to anyone who knew any law, whether Jewish Christian or who understood the law of Moses, or Gentile who understood generalities of law. No one is ignorant of the fact that law doesn't follow one to the grave, right? That you don't have to be a Jew who had observed Judaism to understand that, right? Law doesn't follow you to the grave. These Christians had not died physically, but spiritually to sin. Therefore, they were no longer bound by the law of Moses. They were no longer bound by the law of Moses. Verses 2 and 3. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loose from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband liveth she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. So again, this passage is misused to support some position regarding divorce and remarriage. Romans 7 It's one of the most misunderstood and abused of all biblical chapters. The early part is abused by making marriage the thrust of the Pauline remarks, when in reality, Paul used a marriage relationship as an illustration of the point at hand, Brother Taylor. And so essentially what he's saying is that the context of what Paul is talking about is not axiomatic about marriage. He's not, or rather it is. He's using the law of marriage to teach another lesson, right? He's not discussing marriage, divorce, and remarriage, right, in this passage. That's not what Paul is talking about. But yet many people will take what Paul said here and misapply it to that discussion, when that's not what Paul was trying to even discuss here. He was just simply showing how the law works. The law of marriage, which we stated is axiomatic, right? Marriage is done at death. And so that's all that Paul is trying to show here. He is using that truth to teach them about their current position versus their former position. Right? That's what he's doing here. And so a married woman is in subjection to her husband while he lives. However, if she joins herself to another while her current husband lives, she's identified as an adulteress. But if the woman is married after her husband dies, she has done rightly and shall not be identified as an adulteress. This analogy is limited. It does not consider a potential divorcer for marital infidelity. Such would serve no purpose in this example. I've had this conversation several times. I'm just like, that's not even what Paul is talking about. So the idea of trying to interject something into this passage, it doesn't even fit the context. Right? It doesn't even fit the context. And so again, as I've stated before, so say it now again, a text out of context is a pretext, which leads to error. You have to understand what the writer is talking about. What is he talking about? Who is he talking to? That's paramount when we are striving to be diligent Bible students. Some have misconstrued Paul as to think that since he does not mention the exception of Matthew 5:32 and 19:9, fornication and remarriage rights for the innocent one, that such an exception no longer exists. Such is eisegesis, not exegesis. Right? I don't ever want to eisegete a passage. Eisegete is when we read into the passage what we really would like it to say. That's when eisegesis happens. Jesus used the word exegete or exegesis, which is rise from the word exegete. Jesus used his word in John 1:18 when Jesus said, "No man has seen God at any time." Right? The only begotten of the Father, the only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. That word declared is the Greek word exegiomai, and that's where we get our term exegete. So Jesus, and to exegete means to pull out or to show out. And so what Jesus did as a person, he declared God. He exegeted God. This is why Jesus is not the Father. But this is why he would say in John 14, when Philip said, Lord, John 14:7-9, Lord, show us the Father, and it sufficeth us. And Jesus said, have I been so long a time with you, yet hast thou not known me, Philip? He that hath seen me hath seen the Father. Right? Hence, and so how sayest thou then, show us the Father? Right? If you've seen me, you've seen him. We're the same essence. Like I'm doing his will. I don't speak anything that's contrary to him. I don't act any way that's contrary to him. I don't think in any way that's contrary to him. And so you've seen me, you've seen my Father. Not that you were literally looking at the Father when you looked at Jesus Christ, but in essence and thought and purpose and action, they were the same. And so Jesus is like, you don't need to see the Father. You're looking at me. I'm his son, right? I am deity. Colossians 2:9, for in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. You're looking at God. Manual 1:23, God with us. Right? So I promise you, the Father, Son, and Spirit are never going to contradict one another, ever. In thought, word, or action, ever. They will never contradict one another. so when Jesus in John 1:18 said, I have declared him, or that's what John wrote, he declared him. Jesus showed out God. So if you ever want to know what the Father would do, right, or what God would do, now how would God treat his enemies? Just look at Jesus. How would God show his benevolence? Just look at Jesus. How would God forgive people? Well, look at Jesus. So if you ever wonder, that's why Jesus said, have I been so long a time with you, yet hast thou not, known me, Philip? Right? Because Philip was like, show us the Father. Jesus said, you know him, and henceforth you've been with him. Well, show us him, and we'll, that'll be enough, Jesus. That'll be enough. All right. So again, to eisegete a passage is wrong. Right? We don't eisegete, we exegete. We show out, we pull out of the passage based on the context what the meaning is, and even to some degree what the application is. Right, to some degree, because we can misapply passages. Right. Any of y'all in here know? I'll give you a perfect example. Any of you in here know Philippians 4:13? I'm sure you can quote it. Right. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens. Now, what does all things mean? Right. Everything. What does everything mean? All right. Here we go. Right? Or better yet, 450. Right. Let's just keep going. 800. Right? All right. Now, if you misapply that passage, it's going to be bad for you when you get under 800 pounds of weight on a bench press. Right? There are probably two people in here, that'd be Kyle and Adam, that could maybe do 800. Almost. $7.99. Right. But what's going to happen is, when you eisegete and you misapply, it almost never works out well for your doctrinal positions. And so you have to be very careful. And so this is why we don't eisegete passages. This is why we strictly exegete. And that's what good gospel preaching does. It exegetes passages, right? That's what we do as gospel preachers. We help the members understand. Not that we have a monopoly on God's word. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that there's not members who are not as studied as gospel preachers. But generally speaking, gospel preachers, beside the elders, are generally, and I mean, are generally more studied than the members. That's neither right or wrong, good or bad. I'm just saying that we know this, though. We know this. Our job as gospel preachers is to exegete passages and edify the congregation. James 3:1, brethren, be not many masters. Right, that word translates teachers, knowing we shall receive the greater condemnation. And so when I step into a pulpit, I mean, I'm silly. I love to smile. If you know me, you know I don't take myself too seriously. I mean, many of you in here have seen me skate, so you know I don't take myself too seriously. But when we enter a pulpit, right, and we are teaching God's word, and that's very serious. Right? It's very serious business. We want to make sure that we're not misrepresenting God, right, or misstating God, or misapplying passages. Okay, verse number 4. I said all that to say this because this happens often with this first section of Romans 7. It happens so often. And Paul's not even talking about marriage. That is not even a thrust of this section. Verse 4. Wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that ye should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. Paul's point was that the Jews were married to the law of Moses, however, their husband had died. Right? They were married to the law, but their husband had died. And they were free to marry another, Christ Jesus. The Jews simply moved from one marriage to another. They left one subjection for another. Law. The law that governed marriage was not removed. They were no longer under the law of Moses, but under the law of Christ. And the law of Christ does exist. In Galatians 6:1, I think we made reference to this the last time we met. Paul said, brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness. Consider yourselves, lest you also be tempted. Bear you one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. So there is a law. We're not free from law. We have liberty in Christ, but not liberty from law. Right? Generally, Paul speaking in Galatians chapter 5, verse 13, is liberty from the law of Moses. Right? From the burden of carrying the law of Moses, a law that demanded perfection, something that you could never be. Right? And so we have received liberty from that. We're free from that. That don't mean we're free. We're not given a license to sin. That's not what that means. It just means that they were free from that heavy burden, something that they can. You guys remember the Jerusalem Council, it's called properly, in Acts 15, when the Judaizing teachers had gone from Jerusalem down to Antioch and taught that the Gentile Christians had to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. And then Paul and Barnabas withstood them, right? And it was a very heated debate when you notice Acts 15, a very heated debate. And Paul and Barnabas said, we didn't give them space, no, not an hour. Like we didn't allow them to teach that here at all. We stopped them at the door and was like, absolutely not. You will not teach that here. And so the brethren at Antioch was like, hey, listen, will you go up to Jerusalem? Because Jerusalem was seen as the mother church, right? Jerusalem was seen as the mother church. Will you go up to Jerusalem, talk to the apostles, and you guys hash these things out? So Paul and Barnabas go to Jerusalem. They meet with Peter, James, they meet with the apostles, and they come up with this. But remember what Peter said? Like, we can't bind on the Gentiles, something we couldn't keep. We couldn't even keep it. So how are we going to bind it on Gentiles? We have no clue about the law. And we're going to tell them to keep something that we can't even keep. So they were free from that burden of the law of Moses, something that they could never keep perfectly. But they were free to marry another, and that was Jesus. They were now married to God, who is always considered being married to his people. He's always been considered to be married to his people by the contract of the gospel, that they should bring forth much fruit to God, or spiritual offspring. That's what Brother Jackson stated. Verse 5 and 6. For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sin, which were by the law, did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. And so Paul was Jewish, therefore the personal pronoun we. And before those Jewish Christians had converted to Christ, their fleshly devotion and desires, illuminated by the law, did nothing but brought them death. All right, we'll see this in verse number 12. No. Verse 13. But in the flesh does not refer to being alive physically. It referred to the fleshly covenant of which they had been part and parcel. It was a covenant of flesh, a fleshly descent from Abraham. One entered by a fleshly birth to Israelite parents, had an essential right for every Israelite male, the fleshly ordinance of circumcision, when he was 8 days old. Genesis 17, 9 and following, that's the sign of the covenant. The covenant is given in chapter 16, the sign of the covenant in chapter 17 of Genesis. So the sign of the covenant was circumcision. It was circumcision. It wasn't a new practice per se. It didn't come to be only with Abram, but it was the sign between Israel and God. Now, of course, at this time, Israel doesn't exist. Israel is still in Abraham's loins at the time of Genesis 17. But it was a perpetual covenant throughout their generations, right? Throughout the Mosaic system, there will be the perpetual covenant of circumcision. And so the male child born Israelite, circumcised 8 days later, raised as an Israelite, learns of God, just simply the family of God without any decision on their part. So a child is born into the family of God under Judaism. And I think we made reference to this before. In Christianity, it's just the opposite. It's just different. In Judaism, in the Old Testament, you're born into the family of God and then taught about God. Outside of any volition that you have, you don't make a choice as a baby to be born, right? None of us made a choice to be born, right? Which is, as a side note, that makes me count my blessings every day. You know, I could have been born as a female in the Congo. You know that? But I was born in America, right? And in plenteous times. I'm thankful for that. That's a blessing. That's a blessing. And so I like the song, Count Your Blessings, name them one by one, right? We should really count our blessings. When we started, I was doing a mission trip, and I had this Bible study with his atheist. And we were doing mission work across the East, and he came up to me, he's like, all right, so he said, can I share a meal with you? He's from Europe. And I was like, absolutely. So he's like, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. I've lived in 21 countries. I've seen atrocities upon humanity that have caused me to believe that there is no God. There cannot be a God. He said, I'm just having dinner, right? He's like, prove to me your God exists. I was like, I'm stopping eating right now, right? This is not, absolutely. How much time you got? So we have a conversation. But I ask him, but in just kind of casual conversation, I was like, the rest of the world, like what do they think about America? Like, what do you guys think about Americans? It's just interesting. Like, what do you really think about us? He said, well, the problem with Americans is this. He's like, you all are like the richest nation in the world. Like you have wealth, you have everything you want. He said you make up reasons to be mad. Huh. Fair. That makes you. Kyle said that makes him angry. That's fair. That's fair. But that's interesting that we have those blessings that we have. But speaking of being born into Israel, you were born into Israel outside of your choice, and if you were male, 8 days later, you were circumcised, and then you spend the rest of your life being taught of God and coming up under the Mosaic system. Christianity is just different. Christianity, you're taught of God first. You make the conscious decision to be born into His family. Right, that's the way Christianity works. But Mosaic system didn't work that way. So the Mosaic system had ended. They had been delivered from the law. They now serve not a law written on tables, but the law that Christ had written on their hearts. 2 Corinthians 3:3. Next section, the law and sin. Verse 7 through 11. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Now again, you will notice you survey Paul's writings in the New Testament, he does this frequently. Paul is brilliant. Leilani, my little one, she's like, Daddy, who's your favorite apostle? Paul. Like I said it without even thinking. He is just brilliant. And half of the New Testament is about him. As a matter of fact, half the book of Acts is about Paul. Half of the book of Acts is about Paul. The second half of the book of Acts is about the apostle Paul. Half of the New Testament was written by him. Right? I mean, he was just brilliant, and you get we're allowed to get a very intimate view of what his life was like, from going from persecuting the church to being the strongest defender of Jesus Christ. And by the way, that is a proof of Christ. There is no way a man of Paul's intellect, and he was extremely intelligent. I mean, you're studying one of the greatest books ever written, the book of Romans. He wrote that. He was born in Tarsus, raised there under Greek culture, studied at the foot of Gamaliel as a Hebrew, Pharisee, son of a Pharisee. He spoke several languages, quoted pagan poets. I mean, could debate philosophers. Acts 17. I mean, he was just brilliant. And what you see is when he writes, you'll see this all the time. He anticipates objections, right? He just is like, listen, I know somebody's gonna say this right here, and he does a fantastic job of just go ahead and dealing with it before they can even ask the question. He's already dealt with the position that probably logically in his mind would come from what he had just previously said. But then he says, what shall we say? And generally he'll start it with this phrase or some kind of derivation of it. What shall we say then? What shall we say then? So what shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. And then he always answers it that way. Not always, but generally, God forbid, as he's destroying this false position. God forbid. And I had not known sin, but by the law. For I had not known lust, except the law has said, thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. For without the law, sin was dead. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. Did Paul teach that the law was sinful? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The law was perfect for what it was meant to do, and that was to define sin. That was the function of the law of Moses, to define sin. Without the law, the Jew was ignorant of the impact and effects of sin. For example, one could not have defined coveting if the law had not prohibited such and illustrated it. Brother Jackson, I could not know that I'm speeding if there is not a speed limit sign. I can't know it. And so, if the law does not define coveting, right? Paul doesn't know what it is. If I don't know, right? If I don't know, I can't act, and I certainly can't correct it if I'm making a mistake. If I don't know it, I can't correct it. And so, the law made sin, we'll see in verse 13, exceeding sinful. Paul quoted the 10th commandment. The law was never meant to redeem. Galatians 3:19, ever. Galatians 3:19, Paul literally said it never was meant to redeem. Sin personified, right, is given human traits. Sin took occasion. Sin did it. Well, sin is given human traits. It's called personification. Or anthropomorphism when inanimate objects start acting, right? Took advantage of the law to carry out his diabolical scheme. It frequently is the case that when one is forbidden to do something, his evil impulses encourage him to yield all the more, Brother Jackson. The propensity to covet and have lustful feelings are a part of man, just as desires to be kind, gentle, caring, and loving. What distinguishes a commendable character from the condemned character is God's law. If there were no law to reveal the condemned character traits, then sin would be dead or non-existent, Brother Robertson. Mosaic law did not produce the concupiscence, the evil desires, or the covetousness. They were already there, Brother Taylor. Where there is no law, there is no sin. Right? Kyle cannot pull me over for running a stop sign if there is no stop sign there. Now I'm going to sue him, so, listen. I'm going to do like Paul did. I appeal to Caesar. Right? I'm going to use my civil rights, right? As a citizen, I'm going to invoke those. But you can't, like, if there's no stop sign there. No, once they put a stop sign up and I keep going, I've broken the law. It's interesting that we don't say, you've broken the portion of the law that says you're not to run a stop sign. We never say that. If you do anything against the law, we say you have broken the law. James teaches the same thing. Anybody that attempts to keep any aspect of the law, then you'll be guilty of the whole law. Because nobody ever says you just broke this subsection. I mean, the judge will break it down to you if you have lawyers and things of that nature, but generally you just broke the law. And that could be, if you're a lawbreaker, that doesn't mean you broke every law. Right? If you're a lawbreaker, you just have to break one, and you have broken the law. Law of Moses, same way. You one. Like you err in one aspect of the law of Moses, you are guilty of the entire thing. It demanded perfection, and it did not allow for mistakes. Right? I mean, it did, but it came with sacrifices and priests and everything, man. And then you still weren't absolved, right? You just, as Charlie talking this morning, that priest one time a year would go between that veil from the holy place to the most holy place, and he would sprinkle that blood on the ark, and it would cover the sins of Israel just for 1 year. Just roll it over, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 2 and 3. Right, every year. You had to give that sacrifice of atonement. The one that God winked at, right? The one that made God wink. He never just closed his eyes to it. He winked until the lamb could come and offer his blood. Then God no longer had to wink, because those who will be covered in the blood of the lamb, who does God see? His son. So those who are covered in the blood, God doesn't have to look away. He sees his son. Because when you baptize into Christ, Galatians chapter 3, verse 26 and 27, you put on Christ. You put on Christ. You are clothed in Christ. Clothed in his righteousness through obedience. It's a beautiful concept. No man, again, I said before, no man can make up the Bible. I don't care what the detractor and the skeptic and the agnostic and the atheist and the blasphemer. I don't care. You cannot honestly, you can't with an honest heart read the Bible and think man just made it up. There is no way. I fail to believe that. I just fail to believe that. Babies, children, and the mentally ill are mentally incapable are safe. Before knowledge of the law, Paul felt alive and free, but through the law came the knowledge of sin, which forces one to see himself in the light of God's holiness. Right? James said, when you look into the perfect law of liberty, when you and I look into the Bible, it's like a mirror, but we see ourselves the way God sees us outside of his son. That's terrifying, or it should be. Right? You see, you're like, oh my goodness. This is my position. I don't like this. I don't like this. I want to do something about this. And because we serve a good God, he has given us everything we need to do about this. So we look into the perfect law of liberty. That which made Paul feel free and alive was the very thing that killed him, because it was impossible to keep it perfectly. Sin is so deceitful. Sin is so deceitful. Verse 12 and 13. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, just, and good. And I love verse 12, and then, of course, 13 on the hills. The law wasn't the law itself inherently. It's not like the law said, and again, I'm personifying the law. It's not like the law said, I'm going to kill everybody. That's not what the law would want to do, right? But what happened was sin took an occasion through the law, because sin was like, the only way to truly keep this is to be perfect, and I can mess that up. Right, I can mess that up. And that's what Paul is saying. The law itself was holy, just, and good. Really, the only answer you have to use for this, because I did a short for GBN, and the question was, have y'all ever seen the Hay Cliff or Hay, whatever little shorts that they do for GBN? Well, I did one, and it was, did God make a mistake? Was God flawed because he created a new law after the Old Testament? God forbid. Right? It wasn't the law. It wasn't that wasn't the issue. The law was perfect, holy, just, and good. And why was the law holy, just, and good? The only answer you really need to give that should satisfy is that it came from God. And there's your answer. How can it be anything but holy, just, and good if it came from God? Now, function, something totally different. Like if we're talking about the holiness and the integrity of the law versus its function, well, then we've got two different discussions at that point. But the law was holy, just, and good. So recall the objection in verse 13, sorry. Was then that which is good made death unto me? God forbid, but sin, that it might appear working death in me, that which is good, that sin, and again, I love this portion of verse 13, sin by the commandment might become exceeding sinful. There's your purpose for the law. It was to make sin exceeding sinful. The law was meant to illuminate sin and show you just how terrible it was and is. So recall the objection in verse 1. The astute Jewish reader of Paul's argument would surely ask, if I had to be delivered from Mosaic law before I could be justified, does this mean the law was unholy, unjust, and bad? No, to the contrary. The law was given by God, revealed by angels, and dispensed by Moses. The law was holy, just, and good for its intended purpose. It's holy, just, and good for its intended purpose. Now, if you attempt to make its purpose redemption, well, then you're going to have a problem. Now you're going to find yourself kind of in this conflict, right? You're going to find yourself in a conflict because you have misapplied or misfunctioned the law, right? You've misfunctioned the law. How then could it produce death? How could the law produce death? As previously stated, the law was not at fault. It was not the law's fault. Rather, it was sin using the law. The law revealed the deception of sin, and when one examines, understands, and identifies sin with the law, then law has done its work. It's done what it was supposed to do. It's never meant to deliver you from the sin. It was meant to illuminate it and highlight it and define it for you so that you would know that, hey, this is covetousness. This will kill you. That's what the law was meant to do. To define sin, illuminate it, highlight it. So the law was intended to show sin as sin and to highlight it as exceeding sinful. The law simply told the Jew the truth. And again, remember this too. Over the course of the unfolding of the law and its application and living and kind of being the religious covenant in the Old Testament. Also remember this though. It was always meant to be temporary. Remember, it was so as you and I are studying it, right? Sometimes I think this is just kind of a thought on my part, and I could be wrong, but I think sometimes what happens is the law is viewed in a vacuum, right? It's kind of viewed in its own little nook and cranny of the Bible, when really it's part of the larger scheme to bring the Christ in, right? So you have to view it from that position too. When you view it as the temporary method, right? That temporary time, right? And its application to bring the Christ in, it'll start to make more sense to you. Let's see if we can. I don't know that we can get 14 through 17. We got 3 minutes. Well, let's try. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I'm carnal, sold under sin. For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that do I. If then I do that which I would not, I consent unto the law that it is good. Now then, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. Paul's audience knew that the law was spiritual, which conflicts with carnality. The problem was not with the law, it was with fleshly man, who, hard as he tries, sails out to sin, and his sinfulness is reflected by the law's condemnation. Conscience proves that law is good, and when one sins, he practices what his better self deplores. Here, by the sinner's own admission, he knew of a better and higher type of lifestyle. And so no sane person would willingly rebel against God unless sin governs their mind, which then controls their flesh. To employ a further dramatic description, at times, it feels like he has lost his willpower and that sin has taken up residence in him. Let's pick up verse 18 and 19 the next time we meet, and we'll just press along there. We appreciate your undivided attention as the lesson was taught. May God bless you and keep you as you seek to conform your will to his, and we'll consider ourselves dismissed.